Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Now, today we're doing another podcast in two separate episodes because it was just too long. We frequently describe ourselves as the defenders of democracy, but throughout the 20th century, American leaders supported governments that imprisoned opponents, censored newspapers, rigged elections, used torture, and sometimes killed thousands of their own citizens.
The usual justification was national security. During the Cold War, Washington feared that removing an authoritarian ruler might allow a more dangerous communist government allied with the Soviet Union, China, or Cuba to take power.
And that policy is summarized by one notorious sentence. He may be a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch.
Yeah. You know, that quotation is commonly attributed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and supposedly referred to Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza Garcia. But researchers have never found firm evidence that Roosevelt actually said it. The quotation did not appear publicly until after Roosevelt's death and has also been associated with Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo.
The quotation may be apocryphal, but the policy it describes was very real. An abusive ruler could remain an American partner as long as he opposed communism, protected American businesses, allowed military access, or supported American strategic interests elsewhere.
And in many cases, the United States eventually turned against the same ruler it had previously assisted.
Yeah, that reversal is the larger subject of these two episodes. How a useful partner becomes an embarrassment, a liability, or even an enemy. The famous quotation is widely regarded as unverified, whilst official records identify the Somoza government as a longstanding American ally. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense in the context of the times. It's abhorrent, but often politics is a matter of multiple bad choices.
Absolutely, Dr. Dineen. Now, why exactly would a democracy knowingly support a dictatorship? Why? Was anti communism simply just being used as an excuse, Dr. Dineen?
Sometimes, Chandler, it was an excuse for protecting oil and other mineral rights, military bases, American corporations, or just regional influence. But I have to be fair. The fear behind the policy was also genuine. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union completely dominated Eastern Europe. Communist forces took power in China. The Korean War began in 1950. Communist parties and revolutionary movements were growing in all parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East.
Yeah, I actually have another idea about this that is more than protecting oil, more than protecting military bases. What I think is happening here is the domino theory. Well, and why is that an issue? Well, because if you truly believe, that our government, our form of democratic republicanism, if you will, if you really feel like that's the best government, why wouldn't you trust that people would eventually see that instead of struggling? I mean, that is essentially what happened many different times over and over again. But we don't trust it because I don't think we really believe in our government that much anymore.
I
American
agree with you, Dr. Weaver.
American policymakers began interpreting local conflicts as parts of one worldwide struggle. A labor movement, a land reform program, nationalist government, or military rebellion might be treated as evidence of Soviet expansion.
And that left very little room for countries that wanted to remain neutral. Political movements were often divided into two categories: pro American or pro communist, democratic socialism, nationalism, non alignment, and local reform movements. were frequently viewed with suspicion.
Yeah, and that produced a dangerous oversimplification. Once a ruler declared himself anti communist, Washington might overlook repression, corruption, fraudulent elections, and political violence.
And the ruler had an obvious incentive to call every opponent a communist.
That happened repeatedly. Labor organizers, journalists, priests, and other religious leaders, farmers demanding land reform, opposition parties, and civil rights advocates could all be placed under the same label.
American officials often argued that they were selecting the less dangerous of two bad choices. An authoritarian ally might eventually liberalize, they believed, while a communist government might become permanent. Shows very little faith in our form of government.
Yes, it does, Dr. Weaver, but democracy kept being postponed.
Sometimes for 30 or 40 years or more.
Joseph Stalin seems to belong on this list, but he was a communist dictator. Supporting him could not have been based on anti communism.
Chandler, you're quite correct. Stalin is an important exception because his case reveals the broader rule behind the policy. The United States has sometimes cooperated with a brutal government when a more immediate enemy appeared more dangerous. Before the Second World War, President Franklin Roosevelt publicly described the Soviet Union as an absolute dictatorship. Stalin had already presided over political purges, forced collectivization of land, imprisonment, mass deportations, and enormous loss of life.
Absolutely correct. And Stalin also signed a non aggression pact with Adolf Hitler in 1939. The Soviet Union then occupied eastern Poland, annexed the Baltic states, and fought Finland.
But Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the calculation changed immediately. Nazi Germany became the overriding threat. Roosevelt blocked efforts to prevent the Soviet Union from receiving American Lend-Lease assistance. The United States supplied the Soviet war effort with aircraft, trucks, locomotives, food, industrial equipment, fuel, raw materials, and other assistance. That support didn't mean Roosevelt approved of Stalin's dictatorship. It meant defeating Nazi Germany took priority over every other concern. And the Soviet military was doing most of the fighting against Germany on the Eastern Front.
Yes, Soviet forces suffered catastrophic casualties of up to 12 million, while destroying a substantial portion, approximately 70%, of the German military. American and British leaders understood that defeating Hitler would be much harder if the Soviet Union collapsed.
But the alliance contained a basic contradiction. The United States was cooperating with one totalitarian government to defeat another.
Then, almost immediately after the war, the alliance became the Cold War.
See our Clockwork Past Cold War podcast to learn more about that. When the common enemy disappeared, disagreements over Eastern Europe, Germany, the use of nuclear weapons, and Soviet expansion became dominant. Stalin changed from friendly wartime ally to America's principal adversary.
Stalin was not an American creation, puppet, or anti communist ally, but his case established a recurring pattern. Immediate strategic necessity could outweigh concern about the character of a partner's government. The State Department describes the 1941 1945 US Soviet alliance as essential to defeating Nazi Germany and documents Roosevelt's decision to send Lend-Lease assistance despite recognizing Stalin's government as a dictatorship.
Now let's look at Nicaragua and the first of those model, quote, useful dictators. The Somoza family in Nicaragua became one of the clearest examples of an anti communist dictatorship supported by the United States. And Antonio Somoza Garcia rose through the Nicaraguan National Guard, an institution created and trained during the period of American military involvement, indeed occupation, of Nicaragua.
Somoza then used the Guard to take control of the country. He became president in the 1930s. Elections continued, but political power rested with Somoza, his family, business associates, and the National Guard. Opponents faced intimidation, imprisonment, exile, and even violence.
Yes, Somoza cooperated with Washington, protected American interests, and presented himself as a dependable anti communist. His government sought American military aid and training for the National Guard.
He also assisted American operations against other governments.
Yes, Somoza offered Nicaraguan territory, training areas, and military support to forces preparing to overthrow Guatemala's government in 1954 and attempting to overthrow Fidel Castro 7 years later. The dictatorship was not merely tolerated inside Nicaragua, it became part of the machinery used against other governments suspected of communist influence.
Yeah, after Anastasio Somoza Garcia was assassinated in 1956, members of his family continued controlling Nicaragua. The dynasty lasted for more than 4 decades.
And Dr. Weaver, the corruption became impossible to ignore.
Especially after the 1972 Managua earthquake. Somoza's businesses, military subordinates, and political allies were accused of diverting international relief intended for victims.
By the late 1970s, President Jimmy Carter was emphasizing human rights. His administration reduced and eventually terminated military assistance to Somoza's National Guard.
Yep, a prime example of what we were talking about earlier. The United States finally turned against the family that it had supported.
Yes, although Washington hesitated because the strongest armed opposition was the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which had Marxist leaders and ties to Castro's Cuba.
That hesitation proved costly. Moderate opposition groups were weakened. Somoza refused a genuine transition, and the country moved toward civil war. The Sandinistas took power in 1979.
And by then, many Nicaraguans associated the dictatorship with the United States.
Yep, that is one of the recurring consequences. When America supports a ruler for decades, opposition to that ruler can become opposition to America. Official American records describe Somoza as a close U.S. ally, document his family's military dictatorship and corruption, and show Carter terminating military assistance before Somoza fell in 1979. Let's move to Iran. Iran in 1953 was one of the most consequential examples. Now, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was a nationalist, not a Soviet-controlled communist. He had been appointed through Iran's constitutional system and supported by its parliament.
His government nationalized the British controlled oil industry. Britain responded with economic pressure and wanted Mossadegh removed. American officials initially hesitated, but after President Eisenhower took office, concern increased that political instability might strengthen Iran's communist Tudeh party and eventually move the country toward the Soviet Union.
So the United States and Britain helped overthrow Mossadegh.
Yeah, the CIA and British intelligence organized Operation TPA-JAX. The operation used propaganda, political contacts, payments, demonstrations, and support for military action. After an initial failure, The operation succeeded. In August of 1953. Mossadegh was removed, and Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi returned to power.
President Eisenhower privately acknowledged that the United States had actively helped restore the Shah and eliminate Mossadegh.
The Shah then became one of America's most important Middle Eastern allies.
Yeah, he purchased large quantities of American weapons, cooperated on intelligence, opposed Soviet influence, and supported Western access to Persian Gulf oil.
But his government became increasingly authoritarian. Political opposition was restricted. The security organization SAVAK became notorious for surveillance, imprisonment, abuse of dissidents, and even torture.
Washington saw the Shah as stable.
Many Iranians saw a leader protected by foreign intervention. The 1953 coup became a lasting grievance and contributed to the belief that the United States preferred a cooperative monarch to an independent Iranian political system.
The Shah was overthrown in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The government that replaced him, an Islamic fundamentalist government, became far more hostile to the United States. We're dealing with that to this day.
Yes, sir. So, short term stability produces long term hostility in this case.
Precisely. Supporting an authoritarian ally can suppress conflict for a time without resolving it. When the government collapses, years of accumulated resentment can erupt at once. Eisenhower's diary explicitly acknowledged the covert American role in restoring the Shah and removing Mossadegh.
1 year after the Iranian coup, the United States helped overthrow another government, this time closer to home in Guatemala. Jacobo Árbenz had been elected president, introduced an agrarian reform program intended to distribute unused land to poor farmers.
The reform affected the United Fruit Company, a major American corporation that controlled large amounts of Guatemalan land.
Absolutely. Some communists held influence in labor organizations and supported Árbenz' coalition. American officials became convinced that communist influence inside the government threatened the region.
But the administration often treated land reform, labor organization, economic nationalism, and communism as though they were the same thing.
But what did the CIA actually do?
It organized an operation to remove Árbenz. A rebel force led by Carlos Castillo Armas was trained outside Guatemala. Operation included propaganda broadcasts, diplomatic and economic pressure, psychological warfare coordinated by Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, sabotage training, weapons, aircraft, and bombing missions.
The small rebel force was made to appear larger and stronger than it was. Guatemalan military officers became convinced that Árbenz could not survive without provoking direct American intervention.
Árbenz resigned in June of 1954. Castillo Armas eventually took power about a year later.
And he was not a democratic replacement.
Yeah, he governed by decree, restricted political activity, reversed land reform, and weakened the democratic institutions that had developed during Guatemala's previous decade of reform.
American officials achieved their immediate objective. Suspected communist influence was removed.
But Guatemala then entered into decades of instability and violence.
A military government, insurgency, political repression, and civil war followed. The message sent to other Latin American reformers was unmistakable. Even an elected government could be removed if Washington concluded that its policies benefited communism. The CIA's own historical memorandum details its training, propaganda, air operations, economic pressure, and paramilitary role in overthrowing Árbenz.
South Vietnamese President Nguyen Diem is another example of the United States supporting an authoritarian anti-communist and then deciding, oh, he had just become a liability.
After Vietnam was divided in 1954, the United States supported Diem as the leader of South Vietnam. Washington believed he could prevent communist North Vietnam from taking control of the entire country.
American money, equipment, military advisors, and political support helped sustain his government, but Diem concentrated power in his family, restricted opposition, manipulated elections, suppressed critics, and favored loyalists, whether they were competent or not.
And the conflict with South Vietnam's Buddhists made the situation much worse.
In 1963, security forces violently suppressed Buddhist demonstrations. The public self-immolation of Buddhist monks drew international attention and criticism towards the government's conduct.
American officials became convinced that Diem and his brother, Nguyen were undermining the campaign against the communist Viet Cong.
So, Washington began considering alternatives.
Declassified records show American officials discussing the withdrawal of support if Diem refused major reforms. The United States communicated with South Vietnamese generals who were plotting a coup and indicated Washington would not intervene to save Diem.
The coup occurred in November 1963. Diem and his brother were captured and killed.
Did President Kennedy directly order their deaths?
Well, there is no evidence that Kennedy directly ordered the executions, and he was reportedly shocked by them. But his administration had withdrawn confidence from Diem and chose not to prevent the coup.
And the result was not stability. South Vietnam entered a period of coups and weak governments. American involvement continued expanding. So the United States removed its support from one authoritarian leader without having a workable replacement.
And that is another recurring problem. Washington may become deeply dependent on one ruler, decide that ruler has failed, and then discover that the institutions underneath him are too weak to provide an orderly transition. Imagine that. A 1963 American policy paper proposed ending support for Diem if he refused reforms and preparing to support alternative leadership.
Now, I want to talk about the defense of the policy here a little bit and kind of break it down. Were these decisions always irrational from the perspective of the officials making them?
No, Chandler, and that distinction matters. American policymakers faced real threats. Communist governments under Stalin, Mao, and other leaders could be highly repressive. Some revolutionary movements received weapons, money, training, and direction from communist powers.
Some American allies also faced genuine insurgencies. Oil supplies, military bases, shipping routes, nuclear strategy, and regional alliances could not simply be ignored.
Officials worried that abandoning an ally would make every other ally question American promises. They also believed that an imperfect government might gradually reform, while a successful communist revolution might eliminate political competition entirely.
But those arguments could make any dictator appear indispensable.
Yes, that's true. The ruler could say, support me or face communism, civil war, or chaos. Washington then became afraid to test whether that warning was true.
There's another factor. The United States also frequently overestimated its ability to influence an authoritarian ally. Providing weapons, money, or even troops did not mean Washington entirely controlled how those resources were used.
And I think it's very important to note here that continued assistance still helped the ruler remain in power.
And it often helped eliminate moderate alternatives. When democratic reformers, journalists, labor leaders, religious leaders, and opposition politicians were suppressed, the surviving opposition sometimes became even more radical. So, in this first episode, we've seen several forms of partnership. Stalin was a temporary wartime ally against Nazi Germany. Somoza was a long-standing anti-communist dictator. The Shah was restored after an American-backed coup. Árbenz was removed because Washington feared communist influence. Diem was supported as a barrier against North Vietnam and then abandoned when his government became a liability.
Now, these were different situations, and they should not be treated as identical, but they do share one principle. Immediate strategic interests were replaced ahead of democratic consistency, and the United States often discovered that it could choose who to support without being able to control what happened afterwards.
Yeah, in episode 2, we will continue with Mobutu, Suharto, Pinochet, Ferdinand Marcos, Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, and the complicated truth about American support for the Afghan resistance and Osama bin Laden.
Several of these partners were also eventually abandoned.
Others became direct enemies of the United States.
And one of the most widely repeated claims that the CIA directly created or funded Osama bin Laden requires some important considerations.
Yeah, the broader story here is still disturbing, but the accurate version is much more complicated.
We hope you've gotten something out of this, and we hope that you'll come back for episode 2 in this examination.
Bye for now, folks.
Bye for now,
Please
folks.
leave a like and a comment.